Welcome back to Sweet Sycamore Podcast. We're on our second episode, and I am so excited you guys are joining me. I don't want to go through the book of Esther alone, and so I'm so excited that we can do this together. We are in the 13th verse of the first chapter, and that's where we're starting off today. If you remember where we left off, Esther 1, we did 1 through 12 on our episode 1, and we left off right where Queen Vashti said, "No, I am not going," as simple as that. And it says that King Xerxes was furious. Now, he's the one that made the inappropriate request of her. And so if you want to find out more about that, I encourage you to go back and give episode 1 a listen to. But where we're starting off today, it says he was furious. And then verse 13 says he immediately consulted with wise advisors. Immediately, he is wanting a group of his wise advisors to basically come together and give him advice on what to do about this wife who will not listen to him, even though it wasn't that she did something wrong. In fact, she was actually doing the right thing. And so he pulls people together to figure out her punishment. And I look at this and I'm like, okay, for reals. Like, here is this woman who is actually obeying Persian law, and that's why she wouldn't come, is because there was a modesty law in place that for her to go before the king, whether it was the innocent approach of in her royal garments to go before him in her crown, or if it was the worst case scenario in which it was just simply naked with just her crown on in front of all these drunk men, no matter which one it was against the law for women. And here she is trying to be a queen, holding her character and integrity intact. And you would think that if he got all these wise advisors together, that they would be trying to say, you know what, let's figure out a way to praise her for doing the right thing. Instead, they're trying to figure out a way to punish her for doing what is the right thing, or what was the right thing. Now, if these are really wise advisors, then first off, they shouldn't open with immediately that he consulted them to come up with a plan. Wise advisors would say, hey, wait a minute. Not only are you drunk with rage, it says he was furious, but also he was drunk with wine. It says that he called for her when he was drunk with wine. And then it says immediately following is when he gets with these advisors. So these advisors aren't the best for sure. And we're going to see that as a common theme with King Xerxes, he keeps really bad company. But here, they're making decisions right now. And we actually see that he regrets making this decision so fast later. And I think there's just a small lesson to be learned even right here, that sometimes we get brain fog too. We may not be drunk with wine like King Xerxes, but very reasonably we can be drunk with a furious rage, or we can be drunk with emotion. We can be so hyped up on emotions and we make decisions that later on we regret. Let's take a lesson from King Xerxes right here and take that moment to pause and make sure you're surrounding yourself with people that would encourage you to take the pause, to allow the fog of all of the emotions to pass by so that you can make a decision that you could stand behind later. Because honestly, he regrets this decision later. So go to God. Find people that will surround you to go to God. But that's not what these advisors are doing here. And they tell him that Queen Vashti has not only wronged him, but that she has wronged every noble, every citizen in the entire empire. They say women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Okay, realistically, do we think that women all over this massive empire are going to start despising their husbands simply because Queen Vashti said no to an immoral request from her husband? Seems a little far-fetched. It seems a little unrealistic to me to think this, but this is what these men are going for. They're trying to make sure that women never disrespect their husbands in public. Now, we actually see a lot of societies still thrive on this right now. We are in a great society here in America where women still have a voice and women can speak their minds, but there are still a lot of places where that is not something that is favored upon or even allowed. And one of the things I want us to pull out here is this idea that you can't forcefully make somebody respect you. Like, this is what they're trying to go for. Women should never disrespect their husbands, and so we need to make sure this never happens. I think we need to understand that Vashti did not rebel against her husband, but against the evilness that her husband was asking her to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen Queen Vashti already putting on this massive party, which it was something that was expected of her. She was obeying her role as wife of the king. So she wasn't rebelling against him. Actually, she was in the middle of obeying him when he came to her and put her in the compromising situation. Her husband made a decision about the state of her relationship, not her. He made the decision about the state of their relationship. And we have to be able to understand that nowhere can a person force somebody into respect, especially through fear, which is what they're kind of going through here, these wise advisors. I get that every man desires to be respected. And receive honor from their wife. I completely understand that because believe it or not, I want the same thing as a wife. It's Ephesians 5:33 that there should be mutual respect, and especially a wife respecting her husband. But the most precious gift that I can give my husband is respecting him. However, I can still respect my husband and stand against sin. I can still respect my husband and say no. I can still respect my husband and say, that is not for me. There can still be a level of respect. And also that doesn't mean we have to give in to everything that the other person is saying when we know it's wrong. Respect is something that is given. It's a gift, but we cannot demand it. We can't coerce it. Otherwise, it isn't worth anything. It becomes worthless. And that's what these wise advisors are trying to get, is a forced respect. I'm going to tell you, the scriptures don't give us the historical context really, or history doesn't tell us what the response was as these things came out, as these edicts came out about wives respecting their husbands. But I'm sure that it was probably only received well by 50% of the population. Okay, we can all probably assume that pretty clearly. Now, part of the edict that comes out of this wise council immediately following Queen Vashti's no was that Queen Vashti was banished. Now, banished means that she was banished from the king's presence when we look at the original context. So, good news is for Queen Vashti, doesn't mean death. What it does mean is she's no longer queen, and she's no longer able to be associated with King Xerxes. Believe me, the woman probably said, thank goodness. She was probably sent out to a cottage by the sea and to live her life in happiness. And I wish her the best because some of us may want to be banished the way Queen Vashti was probably banished. But you know what? It wasn't like she was killed off, but it was a stripping of the title. I'm sure it was embarrassment. I'm sure her entire circle of friends was gone. You can't tell me this didn't hurt. But there was also probably some relief on what she got to let go of. But so there was letters that go out to all of the women and the men, the entire empire, that lets everybody know of her disobedience. But it also lets every wife know that she has to submit and she has to respect her husband. So this is a decree that is published through the king's vast empire. It says husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive a proper respect from their wives! ! And then it says, the king and the nobles thought this made good sense. Okay, so there definitely was not a woman on the committee of this wise council, okay? Because no woman would say that makes good sense. Because what does this edict actually tell us? Well, first of all, if you didn't know that Queen Vashti stood up to her husband, now you do. Now you do. And you're probably questioning, well, why does she stand up to King Xerxes? And why would she let go of all of this? Like, she had to have a good reason in order to let go of all she let go of to keep her own character, her own dignity intact. Now, as this came out, would husbands go, yes, I believe in this edict, and now my wife must respect me? So what if she doesn't? Do you have the power, like King Xerxes, to banish your wife to a cottage by the sea, or just to move her out of your way? Absolutely not. Okay, so really, they don't have the authority like King Xerxes to banish their wives. So they've got to work through this, and this is where it looks to me like, being a woman, which women really haven't changed a whole lot, that you would go, wait a minute. What this tells me is that a woman stood up. This also doesn't impress me with his power. This shows me that he's trying to grab at power. He's trying to force power. And my guess is that this edict coming out actually probably lost the favor of half of the nation. That he probably lost the respect from half of the nation, being those women. Xerxes definitely had poor advisors all the way around him. And I think as women, we need to understand that we can never be forced to give respect. And I think men, it goes vice versa. Whether you're a man or a woman listening to this, we can never be forced into providing respect, but that is something we should give if we can. However, if it goes against what God is calling us to do, we have to stand up and we have to remember that all submission is secondary to that of God and what He is calling us to do, what He is calling us to be like. Now, both of these women that we're going to go through, I mean, we're only going through Queen Vashti. We won't hear from her again after today, but we're going to dig really deep into Esther. I'm going to tell you that I believe both of these women could stand up and say, for such a time as this. Vashti needed to stand up in this moment because she made room for Esther. And that was part of the edict, that the king would be able to find a bride worthy of him. I'm sure that was hurting words for Queen Vashti, but that's where we get Esther coming on the scene. I think sometimes we have to pull a little Vashti, and we need to be able to rebel against evilness that is going on in our own house. We can't let things just go unseen because it's part of who we are or it's part of the way we've always done things. Because that one thing could be what eats our family alive. I have been in the church since I was 16 years old. I have been working in the church, and I'm going to tell you that I have seen over on a repeat basis that little sins that people let go and they just say, we can survive through this. This is not going to faze us. That's what ends up destroying their family later. Whether it be a work relationship that a wife is perfectly fine with her husband staying way too close to a female, going out and having a lot of private meetings with, and she goes, it's not something I'm willing to battle over. It's okay. And then when she doesn't, guess what happens later? It's those little things, but it can be so little as the fact of like not going to church, and you're like, well, we're a Christian family and we believe in the Lord, and my kids are good. I don't need to go every Sunday. We've got other priorities. And then all of a sudden as they grow, it feels like God keeps getting further and further and further because these small things, these things that they just let go unseen. And even those small things of just laziness, we can say, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to take a stand in my house and I have to bring God back into the center. And I think that's a question I think we should all pause and ask ourselves is, what do I need to rebel against even in my own home? Even some things that are good, we can rebel against the good because we know that if we rebel against the good, God can bring the great. Because I know when God calls us from good to great, He is calling us to sometimes let go of things or move things over so that He can make space, so that He can make room. It's like, I know that we need this RV trailer, but I also know that God's calling me to tithe. I know that God's calling me to give the 10%, and I need to let go of this good thing because I really want the great. And I will tell you that God will always, when He's calling you to do this stuff and when He's laying on your heart, and you'll know those moments, those are those times we even let go of the good things because we know He's calling us into the great. So that's the thing. You sometimes have to take this rebel edge and say, I'm going to stand up, and this is what God's calling us to as a family because I want more of Him. I want Him to be the center. I mean, the only time we speak of Queen Vashti is now. But we also look at that both Queen Vashti and Esther were women that were faced with unique situations and challenges, and they were called to lead in a man's world. Oftentimes, being in women's ministry, I'll have women come to me and they'll say, I just wish my husband would lead. I just wish he would lead. And I'll tell you, I'll just tell them, you know what? Sometimes that is the craving of so many women, but sometimes we have to step up and we have to model that for our husband first. And I have seen over and over of women who just step up and they lead their family in the right direction until their husband is capable of doing the same. And they become a living testimony for their husband to come to know the Lord in a deeper and a more meaningful way. And sometimes we do have to be that natural leader. And we see that in both Queen Vashti and in Esther's story. We have to be women of integrity, because others are going to lead us in situations. That's just part of it. You and I are not removed from having friends, having coworkers, being in life in general, sports with our kids, whatever it may be, where we feel like we are being led into compromising situations that we shouldn't be in and we shouldn't be asked of. And those are those times we have to stand up. We have to say no. I mean, look at King Xerxes. When we jump back to verse 13, or actually verse 15, in chapter 1, they said, we sent the eunuchs. We did everything right. And there's so many situations like that in life where people will ask you the wrong thing, to do the wrong thing in the right manner to justify the fact that they still asked you to do the wrong thing. And you have to be able to see the difference. And that's where we become women and men of integrity and character, where we can identify and say, you may have asked that so politely, so kindly. You may have even wrapped that in some pretty wrapping paper, but I can still smell it that is not right. And I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, right? Those are those moments where we have to be aware. And the closer we walk with the Lord, the closer we grow in character and integrity, we're going to be able to sniff that out. Here is Vashti. She had royal blood. Did you know that you and I, when we have given our life over to the Lord, we have royal blood. We are children of God. And just like Vashti, we have royal blood. She had character, and she was not going to let somebody else defile her. She was bold, even when it cost her everything. And she really did maintain her character and dignity through the end of the story. She didn't know God, but she did know that this was wrong, and she stood up for that. And God used Queen Vashti in a redemptive plan for the Jewish people that we're going to see in the chapters to come. She was used by him. I think sometimes we have to be able to know that walking in integrity is always going to take courage. It's always going to take courage. And we see that it takes Queen Vashti courage. It's going to take Esther a whole lot of courage to stand up and do the right thing. And honestly, at the end of this chapter, if I was Queen Vashti, if I was sitting in my cottage on the hill and knowing all that I gave up, I mean, who knows? Maybe life was so poor for her, knowing that she was royal blood and knowing that she always lived life in a castle and she didn't have what she once had. And perhaps, who knows, maybe she struggled through all of that. And maybe she asked the question, well, what did that solve? What did that really solve? Because for her, it looked like it solved nothing. She stood up and she stood her ground for what was right. And then all of a sudden, she's just gone. And everything looks to be going on the same. I mean, nothing changed for a nation. They still lived under a king who only cared about himself. But sometimes we have to just wait and see what God is doing. I mean, none of these events matter to the Jewish people, but they're going to matter a whole lot in the future when Esther becomes queen and they are dependent on her to actually save their entire population of people. Sometimes life is just like a jigsaw puzzle. And we just look at the pieces and we have no logical connection or how they're connected. But God always finds a way to connect it. And sometimes that just takes time. And I just want to encourage you guys. Perhaps you have had to stand up to the evilness going around you. Perhaps you've had to stand up to some things going on in your home and saying, no, I'm not going to allow this happen. And you think, what did that get me? Except the silent treatment or anger or broken relationships. And I just want to encourage you just to keep going, not to give up, because God sees the big picture. You weren't meant to be a doormat. You weren't meant just to roll over and say, well, whatever happens, happens, and I guess I'll just let it all happen. But we also were meant to bring people closer to Jesus. So when we stand up and we say enough is enough, we have to do it in a way that fulfills the ultimate purpose of living as Christian men and women. And that is to say, listen, my goal is to bring you closer to Jesus, but I have to stand up against this that's happening right here and right now. And to do that, it honestly takes courage. I often think of it like a tightrope. I have never been a tightrope walker, nor would I ever want to be, but sometimes it feels like I am walking on a tightrope when I am trying to obey Christ and what Christ has called me to keep my family on the right path, to make sure God is the center, to stand up for any kind of evilness or stand up when I've been placed in compromising situations, but still make sure that I am leading those people closer to Jesus and not pushing them further away. Yes, it is like a tightrope. But after 20 years of ballet, one thing that I heard all of the time in every class daily was pull up in your center, pull up in your center. And it's amazing how when you pull up in the center of your belly, you can actually be lifted high. You can go higher on your toes. You can hold your balance for so much longer. And I go back to that on a day in, day out basis. To be able to walk this tightrope, I have to pull up in my center. And God has to be my center. And when God is my center, it's amazing how I can make that balance look so gracefully, even when I feel like I am struggling so much on the inside. So that wraps up Queen Vashti, but we still will be digging into Esther starting next Wednesday on our next podcast. Hey, great news. If you are wanting to start a Bible study, whether you are at your workplace and you have like a 30-minute lunch, or whether you are just wanting to do something more deeper by yourself, if you go to sweetsycamore.com, we actually have some Bible study guides. It's 2 pages of curriculum that go hand in hand with these podcasts. So if you want to take it to a deeper level, feel free to grab those and you can print those off online. Hey, we love you guys, and I hope you have an awesome day.